when we see older kids or autistic children with retained primitive reflexes, we can see that they are just in that chronic state of fight or flight. We can see that they have anxiety, nervousness, poor coordination. Sometimes they'll have allergies, sensory sensitivities. We'll see challenges with impulse control, attention challenges, sleep issues. They're just struggling to connect and really make those good long connections with caregivers, peers, anyone. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Jessica, and this is All Things Sensory by Harkla.
We are both certified occupational therapy assistants, and together with Harkla, we are on a mission to empower parents, therapists, and educators to help raise confident and strong children of all abilities.
On this podcast, we chat about all things sensory, diving into special needs, occupational therapy, parenting, self-care, overall health and wellness, and so much more.
We are here to provide raw, honest, and fun strategies, ideas, and information for parents, therapists, and educators, as well as other professionals to implement into daily life.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey there, welcome back to All Things Sensory by Harkla. We're so happy that you've chosen to listen to us today and hang out with us today, watch us today. I'm Rachel.
I'm Jessica.
And today, in honor of Occupational Therapy Month, Autism Acceptance Month, my birthday month. No, I'm just kidding.
It is your birthday month.
It is my birthday month.
Woo!
But in honor of that, all of those, fabulous holidays, we are going to talk about primitive reflex integration and which primitive reflexes we often see in our autistic clients. So we are going to talk about two of our favorite topics. And yeah.
And we'll answer a listener question at the end.
Yep. Really
trying hard to get caught up on your questions that you send us.
Yeah.
So thank you for your patience if you have a question that we haven't answered yet.
Yes. All right. Starting with our primitive reflexes. If you've been here for a minute, you probably are like, why are these chicks still talking about primitive reflexes?
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully if they're still here, hopefully if you're still listening, it's because we keep talking about them.
And you're like, let me learn more about it.
Yeah. Hopefully.
I did actually search the other day because I wanted to listen to something besides us about primitive reflexes. So I was like, primitive reflexes. And
did anything
it was
pop
a
up?
chiropractor's episode that came up that I was listening to.
Was it any good?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a different perspective, which I appreciate, different perspectives. Okay. Yeah. Great. But yeah, I mean, maybe you're here and you're like, I want to learn as much as I can about primitive reflexes, which is why today we're going to talk about primitive reflexes and autism and kind of that connection there. So if you are over us hearing about primitive reflexes, let's just do a quick breakdown about what they are in case we have new listeners here who are like,
what are they? Sure, yeah. So primitive reflexes, we are all born with them. They are stereotypical movement patterns that in infancy and toddlerhood are designed to keep the baby alive and thriving and move through developmental milestones. And we talk about this in our full digital course on primitive reflexes, but each primitive reflex kind of goes along with a developmental milestone. And so as that developmental milestone is reached in infancy, we see those primitive reflexes also start to integrate, which when they integrate, we sometimes like to say they go away. They're not really gone, but they're like hidden kind of, and they've made way for more mature movement patterns to develop, more intentional movement patterns as the child grows, which then builds a solid foundation to then allow the child's prefrontal cortex to develop, because primitive reflexes live in the brainstem. Once they're integrated, the brain can fully develop, and we can see those higher level cognitive skills start to develop.
Wow.
How was that?
That was wonderful.
Was that pretty good?
That was great.
Thank you.
Yes. Love that. So with these primitive reflexes, there's numerous research articles that connect primitive reflexes when they're retained or not integrated, connecting to autism. And we've got one linked in this episode. So we'll make sure that we link the article in the show notes for you. But we generally see why autistic children are retaining or holding on to these primitive reflexes. We see neurological differences, we see sensory processing challenges, we see motor coordination difficulties, and we often see challenges with muscle tone. Low muscle tone generally, but oftentimes we'll see high muscle tone as well. So I think knowing that we see those connections in our autistic clients, we can generally see that connection between the retained primitive reflexes because the symptoms are very similar. And it's hard to, have that conversation of what came first, are the reflexes retained and those are causing some of those challenges that I just mentioned, or what's the opposite of that?
Or is the child autistic and neurodivergent, which then causes the reflexes to stay stuck in the body as a protective mechanism?
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's why we work together. But keeping in mind also that just because a child has retained primitive reflexes doesn't mean that they're autistic, or just because a child is autistic does not mean that they have retained primitive reflexes. Keep that in mind.
Yes. Okay, let's break down some of the common reflexes that we will see in our autistic clients. The first one being the Moro reflex or the startle reflex. This is the one where you set the baby down and their arms startle, they wake up, they cry, they try to cling to their caregiver or their adult for comfort and for safety. And, thinking about it in the primitive days, they're clinging to try and hold on to their caregiver to survive, basically. I always think of the little monkeys that hold on to their little moms. That's basically what the Moro reflex is working on here. And so what we see later on, if this reflex is retained, is we see that brain stuck in that fight or flight pattern. The reflex should integrate by around 6 months. So when we hear a loud noise or when our crib is jostled, we're not startling to the point where we are clinging for life and crying and being extremely fearful. We can startle and then realize we're safe and then go on about our day and be comfortable with that, instead of, startling and then having all of the stress hormones flowing about our body and being stressed for the rest of the day and just in that chronic state of fight or flight. So when we see older kids or autistic children with retained primitive reflexes, we can see that they are just in that chronic state of fight or flight. We can see that they have anxiety, nervousness, poor coordination. Sometimes they'll have allergies, sensory sensitivities. We'll see challenges with impulse control, attention challenges,
sleep issues.
They're just struggling to connect and really make those good long connections with caregivers, peers, anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. The next one is the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. We call this the ATNR, or sometimes it's known as the fencer reflex. So in infancy, when baby is laying on their back and their eyes and their head turn to look at an object, either to the left or the right, we'll see their arms move in that same pattern. So whichever direction the baby looks, that arm will extend, the other will flex into the body, and vice versa the other direction. So the ATNR really separates the body into the left side and the right side. It facilitates crossing midline with the eyes, with the arms, with the legs, but also allowing for new neural connections to cross between both sides of the brain. So if this reflex is retained, we're going to see challenges with coordinating both sides of the body together. So challenges with walking, running, climbing, riding a bicycle. We're going to see challenges with reading and writing because of that crossing midline with our eyes and our hands. We're going to see challenges with spatial awareness and understanding where our body is in space. Really anything hand-eye coordination related as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next one is the STNR, or the symmetrical tonic neck reflex. And sometimes this one is referred to as the crawling reflex. This one sometimes gets a little pushback when we're calling it a primitive reflex, because it's not a reflex that we're born with. It's a reflex that develops later on. But because it is so impactful in reaching the crawling, walking milestones, we classify it as a primitive reflex because it does have a very short lifespan, but it is so critical. So oftentimes this is one that this is a reflex.
Just sometimes though.
Once in a while. This is a reflex that splits the body from top to bottom. And so what we'll see is when an infant looks up, they're going to extend their neck and sit back onto their legs. And then when they look down, their neck will flex and then their elbows will bend and they'll go down into like a faceplant position.
It's true.
It is true. But you'll see this as they start to get on their hands and their knees, and they're rocking on hands and knees, like they're working on getting their body to not be at the mercy of their eyes and their neck position. So we want them to be able to progress into that forward crawl, so that way they aren't, I always say they're at the mercy of what their head and their neck is doing. We want them to be able to work through this reflex so that way they can crawl independently. But oftentimes kids who have this reflex that either, doesn't integrate or they're having an issue with it, they won't crawl. They will army crawl. They will scoot on their bottom. They will have a janky crawl where they have like one leg out to the side. And so when we have a retained STNR, we can see challenges with ocular motor skills, visual tracking, copying from the board. We can see issues with riding a bike. That's a big one. Climbing a rock wall, you have to look down at your feet and you have to look up to where you're going. Swimming, coordinated activities, just a lot of those movement activities that are guided by the vision. We'll often see kids being diagnosed with ADHD because they can't sit still, because when a child is trying to copy from the board, it makes their body extremely uncomfortable with those neck tension changes, and they will sit on their legs. They'll wrap their feet around the chair of the chair, the legs of the chair.
The legs of the chair.
The legs of the chair. Blah, 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 blah. And they will try to suppress that reflex from making their work 10 times more challenging. So did I get everything? That's a lot.
I think so. That was a lot.
Let's
move on.
Okay, great.
I think you did.
Let's move on. Rachel, stop talking.
The next one is the tonic labyrinthine reflex. We call this the LTR, TLR. And actually, this probably should have been before the STNR, because what happens through development is the TLR will start to integrate and makes room for the STNR to appear and then integrate. So these two are directly connected. But this is also called the balance reflex. This one really affects muscle tone and muscle strength. So it's also connected to the Landau reflex, but if you have a baby and you see them laying on their tummy, they're doing tummy time, and their head looks up and then their arms also come up and they're in that like flying position, that's the Landau, that's the TLR. So when this reflex doesn't integrate, we're going to see challenges with muscle tone, muscle strength. We're going to see challenges with balance and postural control, because that's directly related to our muscle tone. So the child might be really clumsy, really not coordinated. They might not have the strength and endurance to complete gross motor play activities like their peers. They're going to have challenges with that coordination. They're going to have some challenges sitting still and focusing because their body is so tired and weak that they can't sit up to focus.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen kids struggle with time awareness and organizational skills too with this reflex. And did you talk about muscle tone too?
Yeah.
Muscle tone's a big one with this one as well. Next is Spinal Galant. This reflex is the one where you stroke down the side of the infant's spine and they will kind of have that like ticklish hip response on either side in infancy. And we want this one to integrate from anywhere 6 to 9 months. It kind of helps with the development of crawling and the gait of walking. We see symptoms look like ants in the pants, like the child is just really uncomfortable sitting in their chair. The back of the chair is stimulating this reflex. Their high-waisted pants are really uncomfortable for them. We also see a big connection with this one with bedwetting at night. So we'll have clients who are 9, 10 years old and they're still wetting the bed at night, and it's like, why is this happening? So it's a big one that we want to rule out for retained spinal galant reflex. I've also heard that it can help. I've also heard that it can impact IBS, so irritable bowel syndrome, in adults as well. But this is another one that can get misdiagnosed as a child with like ADHD who's just struggling to sit still. They're really fidgety and uncomfortable. So we want to make sure that we are ruling that one out as well.
Yeah. So that kind of covers the basics. And if you're a therapist working with autistic clients, or if you're a parent of an autistic child, you might recognize some of these challenges that we talked about as related to these primitive reflexes. And we're not saying that, like I said earlier, we're not saying that if your autistic child, has these symptoms or these signs of retained primitive reflex that it's a guarantee. It's just like hey, this is where my child's struggling. Could this be one of the reasons why, and what can I do next?
Yeah, and I also want to make sure that we're not giving you the impression that reflex integration is a cure-all. Like if your child has retained primitive reflexes and they're autistic, we integrate the primitive reflexes and all of a sudden your child's not going to be autistic anymore. No, that's not what we're saying. We're just saying it's a piece of the puzzle. You know, we've talked about the pyramid of learning, which we know that sensory processing, primitive reflex integration is at the base of that pyramid. In order to help the child achieve those higher level skills, we need to make sure that we are integrating the reflexes. So it's just a part of the puzzle that we want to make sure that we're addressing. But unfortunately, it's just not something that's being addressed in every setting. And it's just not something that's talked about. It's not like, hey, you had a C-section, just a heads up, this could potentially impact your child's primitive reflexes down the road, your sensory processing, just be aware of this. There's none of those conversations are happening. So enter Rachel and Jessica.
So if you are a therapist, we highly, highly recommend that you take some training in primitive reflexes. Look at the research. Like Rachel mentioned, we'll link one of the articles in the show notes, but please go do your own research to see what's going on with primitive reflexes. Take some courses. We have a course, Sensational Brain has courses, PESI has courses on primitive reflexes, and just really do your research and your learning to learn how to help your clients, because once you start down this path, you're going to get a new client on your caseload and you're going to watch them run, or you're going to watch them crawl or climb, and you're going to be like, oh, I can see the primitive reflexes. I know exactly how to help this client.
Yeah. Oh, just gives me the goosebumps. I love it so much.
Now, if you're a parent, the first step would be to try to find somebody that you can work with in person, because that one-on-one therapy is like always the best option, always the best route to go. So if you can get an in-person evaluation with a trained specialist who works with primitive reflexes, that's ideal. If you're on a wait list, or if your child's therapist isn't trained in primitive reflexes, our digital course is also, we have a parent version of our digital course to teach you about primitive reflexes. So that's also an option.
So hopefully this episode was helpful. Hopefully you loved it. Hopefully it was, just something new for you to digest in the area of primitive reflexes. Leave us a review. Make sure that you are subscribed wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. We do drop a new episode every Wednesday. So add that to your calendar so you don't forget to listen.
All right. So the listener question is this: are there specific retained reflexes to address with regards to children or people with PDA? Any insights and practical support for working with PDA would be useful. Thank you. Side note, we couldn't remember the full name of PDA, so we did have to look it up.
I did remember it, though.
You did, right as I found it, too.
It up. Pathological Demand Avoidance. I don't know why I can never remember it. I think it's because the first thing that comes to my head with PDA is PDA. Like, when you're a teenager, you're making out in front of all the
What does that
people.
stand for in that sense?
I can't remember now, but that's the first thing that comes to my head.
Personal display of affection.
Personal?
Oh, public.
None of us can figure this out.
Okay, so in an OT language, pathological demand avoidance is just demanding. Pathological demand avoidance is avoiding demands, is really what the root cause is.
And it typically...
The
root definition. My understanding is that it falls into autism. Mm-hmm. So a child is autistic, then they're going to have like a secondary diagnosis of PDA.
Yeah. This was not a diagnosis or one that was talked about when we first graduated.
No, this is relatively new within the last couple of years. And to be totally honest, I don't have a ton of experience with it. I haven't done a lot of training on it. But my initial thought in answer to this question is probably yes.
I would say fear paralysis and Moro reflex for this one. Anytime a child is demanding, any child avoiding or demand...
Yes, you're right, though.
Anytime a child is avoiding demands or refusing to participate or uncomfortable when someone is saying, hey, go put your shoes on so we can go to the store, my initial thought is they are feeling a threat. They are feeling like a bear is chasing after them, and they are going to withdraw. They're going to fight. They're going to freeze. They're going to avoid. And that's the safety mechanism that they are comfortable with. And so I would for sure look at the Moro reflex. Sometimes the fear paralysis is more of like that freeze response. So I don't know if that's like the most ideal to look at, but definitely the Moro reflex.
Yeah, that would be my go-to as well. And, specifically when we're talking about primitive reflexes, those are the ones that I would address. But in general, working with a child with PDA, I think the big piece is building connection and trust with this child, because they are in kind of that state of fight or flight. They don't feel comfortable. They don't feel like they have any autonomy. They don't feel like they have like no control over their own life. We need to find ways to give them that control and give them that autonomy in a trusting way. And we need to almost be their friends, but in a therapeutic way as therapists, and as parents, setting them up for success with independence.
Yeah.
I think is the trick.
Yeah.
Easier said than done.
It absolutely is. So for this therapist or parent, whoever asked the question, just making sure that we are using an empathetic perspective and we are working on those reflexes, I think is going to be really helpful.
Yeah. Through play. For a child, yes.
Yeah.
All right. If you enjoyed this episode, if it was helpful, let us know. Share this episode with a friend.
Yep. And leave a review. Let us know your thoughts. Make sure you're subscribed, like I mentioned already. And we just appreciate you being here.
Okay. We'll see you next time.
Okay. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to All Things Sensory by Harkla.
If you want more information on anything mentioned in the show, head over to harkla.co/podcast to get the show notes.
If you have any follow-up questions, the best place to ask those is in the comments on the show notes, or message us on our Instagram account, which is at harkla_family or at All Things Sensory Podcast. If you just search Harkla, you'll find us there.
Like we mentioned before, our podcast listeners get 10% off their first order at Harkla. Whether it's for one of our digital courses or one of our sensory swings, the discount code SENSORY will get you 10% off. That's SENSORY.
Head to harkla.co/sensory to use that discount code right now.
We are so excited to work together to help create confident kids all over the world. While we make every effort to share correct information, we're still learning.
We will double check all of our facts, but realize that medicine is a constantly changing science and art.
One doctor or therapist may have a different way of doing things from another.
We are simply presenting our views and opinions on how to address common sensory challenges, health-related difficulties, and what we have found to be beneficial that will be as evidence-based as possible.
By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice to treat any medical condition in either yourself or your child.
Consult your child's pediatrician or therapist for any medical issues that he or she may be having.
This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast.
Thanks so much for listening.